After a heart attack, a businessman flees the city of Chicago in search of silence and solitude at his old farmhouse in the Berkshires. But upon arriving, he finds the house occupied by a widow and her 2 young children. Initially furious, he proposes that they stay for only 10 days and tries to maintain his distance. If this beautiful story of resilience and love has piqued your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Edward Harrison gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The pain in his chest had returned, that familiar, tightening sensation that had haunted him since his heart attack 3 weeks ago. The cardiologist had been blunt. Absolute rest, no stress, no work. "If you keep going at this pace, you won't see 55, were Dr. Miller's exact words. Edward was 52 and sat at the helm of a construction empire worth billions, or rather, he had until he was forced to step away. The asphalt of the main highway gave way to packed dirt as he turned, left toward the family farm. It had been nearly 5 years since he'd set foot on the property. His father had bought the land back in the 70s when this part of the Hudson Valley was considered the middle of nowhere. Now, even with the development of neighboring towns, it maintained its isolated and wild character. It was exactly what Edward needed: absolute silence, fresh air, and above all, solitude. The car jolted over the stones in the path as he approached the entrance gate. He slammed on the brakes. Something was wrong. The gate, which in his memory was a rusted peeling structure, now gleamed with a fresh coat of navy blue paint. The iron bars were clean, without a trace of the rust that had always defined the entrance to the estate. Edward climbed out of the car slowly, feeling his heart race dangerously. He took a deep breath, remembering the doctor's instructions about controlling his anxiety. He pushed the gate, and it swung open without the characteristic screech he remembered. Someone had greased the hinges. The garden stretching toward the front porch was completely transformed. Where once there had been only tall weeds and dry brush, daisies, sunflowers and well-tended rose bushes now bloomed. The lawn was mowed, and the stones of the walkway were clean and aligned. The wooden porch, which used to accumulate dry leaves and dust, now glistened with cleanliness. Edward felt his legs tremble slightly. It wasn't possible for someone to be looking after the property without his permission. He had let the old caretaker go years ago and never hired another. The house key was where he always kept it, tucked under the third planter on the porch. He picked it up with trembling hands and slid it into the main door's lock. The sound that greeted him as he opened the door nearly made his heart stop. Children's laughter echoed through the living room, mixed with the clatter of pots coming from the kitchen. The aroma of a simmering stew and freshly brewed coffee filled his nostrils. Edward stood frozen on the threshold, trying to process what his eyes were seeing. The living room, which he had left covered in sheets and dust, was now perfectly organized. The furniture had been rearranged, creating a cozy atmosphere. Colorful curtains framed the windows and a floral rug covered the hardwood floor. On the sofa, a young woman with brown hair tied in a simple bun was folding small children's clothes. She wore a faded blue dress, but it was clean and well pressed. Beside her, a baby about a year old crawled across the rug, babbling happy sounds. On the floor, near the window overlooking the backyard, a girl about 4 years old slept soundly, clutching a rag doll that looked like it had been mended a dozen times. The woman looked up and saw Edward standing in the doorway. For a moment, time seemed suspended. She went completely still, a small child's shirt still, in her hands. The baby continued his movements on the rug, oblivious to the tension that had settled in the room. The little girl remained asleep, breathing softly. Edward found his voice first. "Who are you?" The question came out harsher than he intended, loaded with all the authority he had exercised for decades in the business world. "What are you doing in my house?" The young woman stood up quickly, dropping some of the clothes she was folding. Her hands were visibly shaking. I can explain, sir." Her voice was soft, with a rural accent Edward couldn't immediately place. "Please don't call the police." "The police?" Edward felt anger rising in his chest, along with that familiar pain. "This is my property. You're trespassing in my home." The baby, startled by the raised voice, began to cry. The woman rushed to him, picking him up with practiced, tender gestures. "Shh, Michael. It's okay," she murmured, rocking him gently. "Mommy's here." The noise woke the little girl, who opened large brown eyes, exactly the same color as her mother's. She looked at Edward with curiosity, showing none of the fear he expected to see. "Mommy, who is that man?" "Isabel, come here, sweetie." The mother's voice was controlled, but Edward could sense the thinly veiled desperation. The girl stood up, still holding her doll, and went to her mother, who now held the baby with one arm and reached out the other to pull her daughter close. Edward looked at the scene, mother and children clinging to one another, visibly afraid of him, and felt something strange stir in his chest. It wasn't compassion, he told himself. It was just the inconvenience of having to deal with this situation when all he wanted was peace. "Explain yourself," he ordered, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. "How did you get in here? This property has been closed for years." The woman took a deep breath before answering. "My name is Claire Bennett. These are my children, Isabel and Michael." She squeezed the girl against her. "We lost our home 2 weeks ago. The landlord sold the land where we lived and we were evicted. We were looking for a place to stay when we found this house." "And does that somehow give you the right to break into my property?" Tears began to well in Claire's eyes. "The house looked abandoned, sir. There were no signs that anyone lived here. The gate was broken, the garden overgrown. I thought no one would mind if we stayed just a few days until we found somewhere else." Edward looked around again, noticing other details for the first time. The house truly was cared for with love. Someone had fixed the kitchen sink faucet that he remembered dripping. The windows, once blurred by dust, now let the sunlight in unobstructed. Even the loose floorboards had been nailed back down. "You fixed the house," he said, more of a statement than a question. Yes, sir." Claire lowered her eyes. "I couldn't stay in a messy place with the children. I tried to take care of everything as best as I could. I thought that when I left I'd leave it better than I found it." The baby had stopped crying and was now looking at Edward with infant curiosity. The girl Isabel whispered something to her mother that Edward couldn't hear. "What did she say?" Claire hesitated. "She asked if you are a bad man." Edward felt as if he'd been slapped. He, who had always prided himself on his reputation as a man of integrity in business, was scaring a 4-year-old child just by being in his own home. The pain in his chest returned with force, reminding him of his current limitations. "I am not a bad man," he said, addressing the girl directly for the first time. "This is my house and you startled me. I wasn't expecting to find anyone here." Isabel stepped out slightly from her mother's protection. "Your house is pretty. Mommy planted flowers." Despite all his irritation, Edward almost smiled. Almost. "I see that." Claire took advantage of the slight drop in tension to speak. "Sir, please, I know we have no right to be here, but if you could give us just a few days to find another place, I promise we won't cause any trouble. I can keep taking care of the house while we're here, and when we leave, I'll leave everything exactly as you want it." Edward watched her closely. There was dignity in the way she spoke, even though she was clearly desperate. Her clothes were simple and showed signs of wear, but they were clean and well kept. The children, though visibly frightened, seemed well fed and loved. "Where is the children's father?" The question made Claire close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, Edward saw a deep sorrow there. "My husband passed away 8 months ago. A workplace accident." Passed away. The words echoed in Edward's mind. She had used a delicate euphemism so as not to say the word death in front of the children, a widow in her mid-20s with 2 small children and no home. Edward felt his stomach tighten. The silence stretched for long seconds. The baby began to babble again, breaking the tension. Isabel continued watching Edward with those large, curious eyes. 10 days, Edward said finally. "You have 10 days to find another place. During that time, I will be staying here as well. This is my home, and I came here for health reasons. We need to establish some ground rules." Claire seemed unable to believe what she was hearing. You're going to let us stay?" 10 days, Edward repeated. "Not a day more. And during that time, I want you to keep the children quiet. I am here to rest, not to hear noise." Isabel whispered something to her mother again, This time Edward heard it clearly. He looks sad, Mommy. Claire blushed and quickly murmured for her daughter to be quiet, but the girl's eyes remained fixed on Edward, as if she could see something the adults could not. Edward turned abruptly. I'm going to get my things from the car. When I get back, I want a full explanation of how you found this property and how long you've been here. He paused at the door. And get ready to look for another place. 10 days go by fast. When he stepped out of the house, Edward realized his hands were shaking and his heart was beating irregularly. It wasn't just from the anger or the shock. There was something else, something he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the contrast between the living, welcoming home he had found and the empty, silent house he had expected. Or perhaps it was the way that little girl had looked at him, as if she could see directly into his soul. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the car, trying to regain control. Through the living room window, he could see Claire hugging her 2 children, likely explaining the situation. The baby was playing with a lock of his mother's hair, completely oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Isabel was still looking toward the door Edward had exited. 10 days. He had promised 10 days. Maybe that was enough time for her to find somewhere to go with the children, and maybe it was enough time for him to figure out why their presence in his house disturbed him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. When he finally grabbed his bags from the trunk and returned to the house, Edward found the table set for 4 people. The aroma coming from the kitchen was irresistible, and for the first time in weeks he felt truly hungry. But there was something more disturbing than the hunger. There was the sound of a family, voices mingling, low laughter, the comforting noise of people who cared for one another. And that scared him more than any business meeting he had ever faced. Edward stood at the entrance to the kitchen, watching the table set with 4 mismatched but clean plates. Claire had her back to him, stirring something on the stove with precise, careful movements. Baby Michael was sitting in a high chair, improvised with cushions, clapping and laughing while Isabel made faces at him. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that for a moment Edward felt like an intruder in his own home. "Mr. Harrison," Claire said, turning when she noticed his presence, "I prepared a simple dinner. I hope you don't mind. It's just rice, beans, and an omelette with some eggs I found in the pantry." Edward frowned. "What eggs? This house has been closed for years." I brought some groceries when we arrived," Claire explained, blushing slightly. "We didn't have much, but I managed to buy the basics before we were evicted. I thought we should leave something in exchange for using the house." He approached the table, noticing that the plate at the head was the only one that matched the set of china he remembered from his childhood. The others were a mix of different patterns, clearly gathered from donations or bought second-hand. Even so, the table was set with care, with a small makeshift vase in the center, containing some of the flowers Claire had planted in the garden. "Mommy, can I tell Mr. Harrison about the kittens?" Isabel asked, swinging her legs in her chair. "What kittens?" Edward asked before Claire could answer. "There's a mummy cat that lives in the barn," Isabel explained enthusiastically. "She had 3 tiny little babies. They haven't even opened their eyes yet. Mommy said they need to stay with their cat, Mommy." Edward looked at Claire, who avoided his gaze as she served the food. "You're feeding cats?" "They were already here when we arrived," Claire said quickly. "The cat looked starving, so I left some scraps for her. I hope you don't mind." Edward sat heavily in the chair. In the last 5 years, this property had become a home for a family of stray cats, in addition to being transformed into a refugee for a desperate human family. He should have been annoyed, but he found he was just tired. "Let's eat," he said simply. During the meal, Edward observed the family dynamic in silence. Claire cut small pieces of omelette for Michael, who insisted on trying to eat by himself, spreading food everywhere. Isabel told elaborate stories about every forkful, turning the rice into mountains and the beans into little soldiers. Claire listened attentively, asking questions and laughing at the right moments, even though Edward could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Where are you from?" Edward asked finally. "From Clearwater," Claire replied. "It's a small town about 40 miles from here. We lived in a small rented house downtown. My husband, Anthony, worked at the local sawmill, and I watched some of the neighborhood children to supplement our income. And after the accident." Claire stopped eating for a moment. The sawmill owner said there was no way to keep the benefits coming. I tried to keep watching the kids, but without Anthony's wages I couldn't keep up with the rent. The landlord was patient for a few months, but eventually he needed to sell the land to a development company. Edward knew those companies well. He had participated in many similar acquisitions throughout his career, always focusing on the numbers, the profits, the efficiency of the deal. He had never thought about the families who were displaced in the process. "And how did you find this property?" "We were looking for shelter," Claire said, wiping Michael's face with a cloth. "We spent the first night at a gas station on the highway. The attendant said he knew of some empty houses in the area. This was the second one we visited." "The second?" "The first one was truly abandoned, but the roof had partially collapsed. It wasn't safe for the kids." Claire looked around the kitchen. "When we saw this house, it looked solid, just neglected, and it has a working well. Clean water is essential when you have babies." Edward followed her gaze, seeing his property through the eyes of a desperate mother. The structure was indeed solid. His father had invested in quality materials when he built the house. The well had been drilled back when the area didn't have a public water supply. Details that were just property features to him represented the difference between safety and danger for Claire's children. "How old are you?" Edward asked. 26, Claire replied. "I know I'm young to have 2 kids and be a widow, but—" "You don't need to justify yourself," Edward interrupted. "It was just curiosity." After dinner, Edward retired to the master bedroom while Claire cleaned the kitchen. He could hear the sound of dishes being washed, the water running in the sink, Isabel chattering about the cats, and Michael babbling in response, sounds that this house had never hosted before. Edward tried to read, a book he had brought, but the noises of domestic routine were simultaneously comforting and unsettling. When everything finally went quiet, he realized he could hear Claire singing softly in the next room, likely rocking Michael to sleep. The melody was simple and sweet, a lullaby he didn't recognize. The next morning, Edward woke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and toast. When he went down to the kitchen, he found Claire already dressed and her hair done, preparing breakfast while Michael played on the floor with some kitchen utensils that made a clatter when banged together. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Claire greeted him with a timid smile. "I hope you slept well." Edward had slept better than he had in months, but he wasn't ready to admit that. "Where is Isabel?" "Still sleeping. She had nightmares during the night and only managed to fall back asleep a few hours ago." "Nightmares about what?" Claire hesitated. "About men shouting, about people taking our things out of the house. She was there when we were evicted, and she was very scared." Edward felt a knot in his stomach. His reaction the day before, shouting and threatening to call the police, had likely brought back traumatic memories for the girl. "I'll try to be calmer," he said, surprising himself with the commitment. During breakfast, Claire casually mentioned that she needed to go to the nearest town to look for work and a place to live. "There's a bus that passes on the main road at 9 o'clock, she said. "If you could stay with the children for a few hours, I promise I'll be back before lunch." Edward nearly choked on his coffee. "You want me to watch the children?" "It's only for a few hours," Claire said quickly. "Michael sleeps most of the morning, and Isabel is very independent. She can play in the garden by herself." "I don't know anything about taking care of children." "It's not hard. Michael has a bottle ready in the fridge if he gets hungry. Isabel knows all the safety rules. She doesn't wander far from the house and always asks me before doing anything." Edward looked at Michael, who was trying to stuff an entire piece of toast into his mouth, and then at the bedroom door where Isabel was still sleeping. The idea of being alone with 2 small children terrified him more than any complex negotiation he had ever conducted. "I can't take them with me," Claire continued, interpreting his silence as hesitation. "The bus is crowded and slow, and Michael doesn't behave well in closed spaces with a lot of people." "Fine," Edward said finally, not believing the words coming out of his own mouth. "But just this once." Claire smiled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I promise I'll find something today. We don't want to overstay our welcome." After Claire left to catch the bus on the highway, Edward found himself alone with 2 children for the first time in his life. Michael was on the living room floor playing with some makeshift toys, pot lids and wooden spoons that made a racket. Isabel had woken up recently and was sitting on the porch, carefully combing her rag doll's hair. Edward tried to work on some documents he had brought, but he found it impossible to concentrate with Michael banging the utensils on the floor every few minutes. When he stood up to ask the baby for silence, he realized the absurdity of the situation. A 1-year-old wouldn't understand requests for quiet. "Isabel," he called from the porch. "Door. Your brother is making a lot of noise." Isabel looked up at him with those big eyes. "Michael makes noise when he's bored. Mommy always plays with him when he gets like that." "Well, I don't know how to play with babies." Isabel considered this for a moment, then stood up and went into the house. Edward followed her, curious to see what she would do. The girl sat on the floor next to Michael and began to sing the same lullaby Edward had heard Claire singing the night before. Immediately, Michael stopped banging the utensils and paid attention to his sister. "How did you learn that song?" Edward asked. "Mommy always sings it to us. It's the song Daddy sang to her when they met." Isabel kept singing, and Michael began to babble along, as if trying to follow the melody. Edward sat in the armchair, watching the two children. There was a tenderness in the way Isabel cared for her younger brother, a responsibility that seemed natural to her, but there was also a seriousness in her eyes that shouldn't exist on the face of a 4-year-old. "Isabel," he said softly, "do you remember your father?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she kept singing for a few more seconds before answering. "A little bit. He used to lift me up high and say I was going to fly, and he always smelled like wood because he worked with trees." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. "Do you miss him?" "Every day, but Mommy said he's watching over us from far away now, that he sent you to help us." The innocence of the statement hit Edward like a lightning bolt. The idea that this child could see him as an envoy from her deceased father was simultaneously touching and terrifying. Michael started to get restless again, and Isabel stood up. "He's thirsty. I'm going to get his bottle." Edward watched her go to the kitchen and return with a bottle that she tested on her own wrist before offering it to her brother. The girl's competence was impressive and unsettling. She cared for her brother with the natural ease of someone much older. When Claire returned at noon, she found Edward and the children in the garden. Michael was sleeping in the shade of a tree, and Isabel had convinced Edward to help her water the flowers her mother had planted. Edward held the hose while Isabel directed the water, giving serious instructions about the right amount for each type of plant. "How did things go?" Claire asked, clearly nervous about how Edward had managed. "Fine," Edward said, surprised to find he wasn't lying. "They actually take care of themselves." Claire smiled, but Edward noticed the sadness in it. They had to learn early. "And you? Did you find anything in town?" Claire's smile vanished. "I visited 3 places that advertised for housekeepers, but they all wanted references I don't have. And the 2 apartments I managed to see were way above what I can afford even with work." Edward saw the discouragement in her eyes and felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. It wasn't just pity, it was something more personal, more urgent. "You still have 8 days," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Something will turn up." That night, after the children were asleep, Edward found Claire in the kitchen, sitting at the table with several papers spread out in front of her. She was doing math in an old notebook, crossing out numbers and starting over. When he walked in, she tried to hide the papers quickly. "You don't have to hide," Edward said. "Money trouble?" Claire sighed. "I'm trying to calculate how much I need for the first month's rent and a deposit somewhere. Even if I find work tomorrow, it will take time to get the first paycheck." Edward looked at the scribbled numbers in the notebook. The amount she had calculated as necessary was ridiculously low by his standards, but it obviously represented a fortune to her. "And if you don't find anything by the end of the 10 days? Claire closed her eyes. "I don't know. Maybe the city has some temporary shelter, or maybe we can stay at the gas station again until something comes up." The thought of that woman and 2 small children sleeping at a gas station made Edward feel an inexplicable anger. Anger at what? He didn't know. "We'll see what happens," he said finally, and left the kitchen before he could say something he might regret. But as he tried to sleep that night, Edward couldn't stop thinking about the numbers in Claire's notebook. the premature seriousness in Isabel's eyes, Michael's happy babbles. How that house had transformed into a real home for the first time since it was built, and how he was starting to fear the moment when the silence would return. On the fourth day of living together, Edward woke not to his internal executive alarm, but to the sound of Isabel chatting animatedly with the cats on the porch. The girl had developed a habit of waking up early to check if the feline family was doing well, and Edward found he liked hearing her invented stories about each kitten. When he went down to the kitchen, he found Claire preparing breakfast with a worried expression. She had returned from town the previous afternoon empty-handed once again, and Edward could see the weight of frustration on her shoulders. "Is something wrong?" he asked, pouring himself some coffee. "Michael has a bit of a fever," Claire said, testing the temperature of her own hand on the forehead of the baby sleeping in her lap. "It's not very high, but he spent a restless night. I'm worried because we don't have a doctor nearby." Edward approached and looked at Michael, who seemed smaller and more fragile when he was sick. "Is there a health clinic in town?" "There is, but I have no way to get him there today. The bus only runs at 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, and even if I could go, I don't know if I'd make it back in time." Edward hesitated for only a moment. "I can drive you." Claire looked up, surprised. "Really? But shouldn't you avoid driving too much because of your heart?" The question caught him off guard. How did she know about his heart condition? He had never mentioned the reason for his presence at the farm. "Last night I heard you on the phone talking to someone about heart medication," Claire explained, blushing. "I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose, but the walls are thin, and I was checking Michael in the next room. I apologize for the intrusion." Edward nodded slowly. "A heart attack 3 weeks ago. That's why I'm here. Mandatory rest." "Then you shouldn't drive on our account. It's only 20 minutes to town, and Michael needs to be examined." An hour later, Edward was driving his BMW along the dirt roads, with Claire in the passenger seat holding Michael, and Isabel in the back seat asking incessant questions about every button and light on the dashboard. At the health clinic, a friendly nurse examined Michael and diagnosed a common virus. "A lot of babies have it around here," she said. "Just keep him hydrated and give him Tylenol if the fever gets too high. It'll pass in 2 or 3 days." While they waited for the prescription, Edward watched Claire interact with other mothers in the waiting room. She spoke naturally, offered help to an elderly woman struggling to fill out a form, and distracted a crying child by pointing out Michael's toys. There was a natural generosity in her. That impressed Edward. At the pharmacy, when Claire opened her wallet to pay for the medication, Edward saw she had only a few crumpled bills and coins. Discreetly, he stepped forward and paid for the items before she could protest. "Mr. Harrison, you didn't have to," Claire said as they left the pharmacy. "It's a loan," he replied quickly. "You can pay me back when you find work." On the way back, they stopped at the local market so Claire could buy some basic household items. Edward stayed in the car with the children while she went in quickly. Isabel took the opportunity to ask more questions about his life. "Do you have children, Uncle Ed?" she asked, using the affectionate title she had adopted without anyone asking. "No," Edward replied. "Why not?" "I never got married." "But you can have kids even without getting married. The neighbor at our old house had a baby and didn't have a husband." Edward smiled despite himself. "That's true, but I worked a lot. I didn't have time for a family." "And now? Do you have time now?" The girl's simple question left him without an answer. He had never thought about it that way. His life had always been structured around work, with relationships being obstacles or temporary distractions. Now, forced into rest, he actually had time. But for what? Claire returned from the market with a small bag and a discouraged expression. "I ran into Mrs. Miller at the market," she said when they resumed the trip. "She knows the whole area and said there are no jobs available in any of the nearby towns. The only possibility would be the city, but that would mean leaving the kids or taking them to a big city where we don't know anyone." Edward felt his stomach tighten at the thought of Claire and the children moving to a big city, vulnerable and alone. "There's still time," he said, even though only 6 days remained of the deadline he had set. That afternoon, while Michael slept off his fever and Claire organized the house, Edward found himself in the garden with Isabel, who had insisted on helping him fix a broken fence she had noticed at the back of the property. "My mommy gets sad at night," Isabel said suddenly as she held the nails for Edward. "How do you know?" "I hear her crying softly when she thinks we're sleeping. She's been doing that since Daddy went away." Edward stopped hammering. "And does that make you sad too?" "Yes, but I can't cry because then she gets even sadder. I need to take care of her and Michael." The seriousness with which the 4-year-old spoke about taking care of her family broke Edward's heart. No child should carry that kind of responsibility. "Isabel, you don't need to take care of everyone. You're a child. Children should play and have fun. But if I don't help, who will?" Edward had no answer for that. In the limited reality of that family, Isabel truly was a pillar of support, however unfair it was. At that moment, they heard the sound of a car approaching. Edward stood up, curious, as he wasn't expecting visitors. An old pickup truck pulled up in front of the gate, and a man about 60 years old, lean and tanned, stepped out in work clothes with a wide smile. "Ed Harrison, what a great surprise!" the man shouted, waving enthusiastically. Edward recognized Joe Stevens, his nearest neighbor, who lived about a mile away. They had met a few times over the years, always brief, cordial conversations. "Hey, Joe," Edward greeted him, walking toward the gate with Isabel by his side. "Man, I didn't believe it when Frances said she saw movement over here. It's been a long time since you've been around." Joe's curious eyes turned to Isabel. "And who's this princess? Don't tell me you got married and didn't tell anyone." Edward felt his face heat up. "No, Joe, it's complicated." "Ah, I see," the neighbor said with a knowing grin. "New romance, huh? Is the lady from around here? Do I know the family?" Before Edward could explain, Claire appeared on the porch, alerted by the noise. She was holding Michael and waved shyly at the visitor. "Good afternoon," she greeted. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What a beauty," Joe exclaimed. "Ed, you didn't tell me you had such a beautiful family." "Joe, it's not exactly like that," Edward began, but the neighbor had already entered the garden and was walking toward the porch. "Joe Stevens," he said, extending his hand to Claire. "Neighbor and old friend of Ed here." "What a beautiful baby. How many months?" 13 months, Claire replied, looking confused at Edward. "And this little doll must be about 4, right?" Joe said, bending down to talk to Isabel. "Spitting image of her father." Edward choked. "Joe, I think there's a misunderstanding." "Nonsense, son. No need to be shy. I always told you to get yourself a family. Working too much isn't good for anyone." Joe turned to Claire. "This one here only lived for business. Good to see he's finally settled down." Claire looked at Edward with an expression that mixed amusement and embarrassment. "Mr. Stevens, actually, I brought some vegetables from my garden," Joe interrupted, heading back to the pickup. "Squash, tomatoes, fresh lettuce. For the new family." He came back loaded with bags. Frances made a cake too. She was so excited when she heard Ed had brought his wife and kids. Edward realized the situation was spiraling out of control quickly. Every attempt at correction was steamrolled by Joe's enthusiasm, and now half the neighborhood would believe he had married in secret. "Thank you so much for the kindness," Claire said politely, accepting the bags. "What generous neighbors you have here, Ed." The use of his first name without the formal sir did not go unnoticed by Joe, who smiled approvingly. "He's a good man, even if he is a bit stubborn," Joe said to Claire. "He'll take good care of you." After Joe left, promising to return with his wife to get to know the family better, Edward and Claire stood on the porch in awkward silence. "Sorry about that," Edward said finally. "It wasn't your fault. He seems very nice. Now he's going to spread it all over the county that I got married." Claire laughed softly. "It could be worse. At least he liked us." Edward looked at her, noticing how the laughter completely transformed her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly relaxed since they had met. "Claire," he said impulsively, "about the 10 days. Maybe we can extend the deadline until you find something suitable." Her eyes filled with tears. "Really? You'd do that?" "It would just be practical," Edward said quickly, trying to downplay the significance of the decision. The house is better cared for with you here, and the children seem to like the place." That night, after Michael's fever had broken and the children were asleep, Edward found Claire in the kitchen preparing a dessert with the fruit Joe had brought. "Thank you," she said without looking at him, "for today, for everything. I know it's not easy having strangers in your house." "You're not exactly strangers anymore," Claire smiled. "After 4 days, we're practically family, according to Mr. Stevens." They laughed together, and Edward realized he was more relaxed than he had felt in years. There were no reports to analyze, no urgent calls to return, no critical decisions waiting for him. There was only the sweet smell of fruit preserves, the soft sound of rain starting to fall outside, and the comforting presence of someone who cared, enough to say thank you. "Edward," Claire said hesitantly, "can I ask why you never married? You seem like a good man." The question caught him off guard. "I always thought I didn't have time. That commitment would be a distraction from important goals." "And now, do you still think that?" Edward looked around the kitchen, seeing Isabel's drawings stuck to the fridge, Michael's high chair in the corner, the washed dishes drying on the rack. Signs of life that had transformed his empty house into something completely different. "Now I don't know what's important anymore," he admitted. From the children's room came the sound of Michael waking up and starting to cry. Claire stood up immediately, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. "I've got it," he said. "You finish your dessert." When Edward entered the dark room and picked Michael up, the baby stopped crying almost immediately and looked at him with big, curious eyes. It was the first time Edward had held a child, and the sensation was strangely comforting. "Hey, little guy," he murmured. "Still feeling bad?" Michael babbled something unintelligible and rested his head on Edward's shoulder. In a few minutes, he was asleep again. When Edward returned to the kitchen, he found Claire watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said softly. "It's just, you're different than I imagined on the first day." Edward felt something stir in his chest, something warm and frightening at the same time. He was starting to realize that perhaps the greatest danger wasn't Claire and the children getting attached to the property. The danger was him getting attached to them in a way that would change his life forever. A week and a half had passed since Edward extended the deadline for Claire and the children, and a surprisingly comforting routine had established itself at the farm. Edward began the day helping Isabel feed the cats, while Claire prepared breakfast with Michael in her lap. Afternoons were dedicated to small repairs on the property, with Isabel always offering her enthusiastic help, and the evenings ended with quiet family dinners. But on that Tuesday morning, everything changed with the unmistakable sound of a luxury car driving up the dirt road. Edward was in the yard trying to fix the abandoned chicken coop when he heard the engines roar. His stomach tightened. Immediately, he recognized that sound, a high-end Mercedes-Benz exactly like the one his former business partner used to drive. Marcia Andrews parked her gleaming car next to Edward's BMW, contrasting grotesquely with the rural setting. She stepped out of the vehicle wearing an impeccable suit, high heels completely unsuitable for the uneven ground, and an expression that mixed impatience with thinly veiled disdain. "Edward Harrison," she said loudly, not bothering to greet him. "We need to talk." Claire appeared at the kitchen door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Isabel ran to her mother's side, instinctively sensing the tension in the air. Michael, in Claire's lap, began to cry softly, as if picking up on the hostile atmosphere. "Marcia," Edward said, trying to keep his voice controlled, "I wasn't expecting you here." "Clearly," she replied, looking around with obvious disgust. "You've been nearly a month without a word, Edward. A month. Meanwhile, the company is falling apart. We lost 3 major contracts because you simply disappeared." "I didn't disappear. I'm on medical leave, as you well know." Marcia laughed, a harsh and unpleasant sound. "Medical leave? You're playing house in the middle of the woods while everything we built over 15 years turns to dust." Edward felt the familiar pain in his chest start to intensify. "My doctor was very clear about the need for absolute rest." "Your doctor doesn't understand business, Edward." "But I do." Marcia's cold eyes turned to Claire and the children. "And from what I see, you've found a very convenient distraction to justify your flight from responsibility." Claire took a step forward. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Claire Bennett. Mr. Harrison was very kind to allow us to stay here temporarily." Marcia examined her from head to toe with a look that made Claire visibly shrink. "Temporarily," she repeated with a cruel smile. "How interesting. Edward, can I speak with you in private?" "Anything you have to say can be said here," Edward replied firmly. "Very well." Marcia crossed her arms. "Our partners are losing patience. The mall project in Denver is delayed because you didn't sign the necessary documents. The residential condo project has been stalled for 3 weeks, waiting for your approval. And yesterday, we lost the city bid because you didn't show up for the presentation." Every word was like a hammer blow to Edward's head. He knew the importance of each of those projects, the millions of dollars at stake, the hundreds of jobs that depended on the company's success. "I told you to take over operational decisions during my absence," Edward said, "and I did. But the clients don't trust me the same way they trust you. They want the great Edward Harrison, the man who turned a small construction company into an empire." Marcia gestured dramatically. "Not your temporary substitute." Isabel whispered something to her mother, and Claire picked her up along with Michael. The two children watched the argument with wide, fearful eyes. "Marcia, I almost died," Edward said, trying to control his voice. "The doctor said if I keep up the previous pace, I won't make it to 55. And what good is living to 80 if you're going to spend the next 25 years watching everything you built crumble?" Marcia pointed to the house. "This is a fantasy, Edward, a pathetic rural fantasy." Claire turned visibly pale at the insult. Edward felt anger explode in his chest. "Watch what you say," he warned. "Why? Am I going to hurt the feelings of your new temporary family?" Marcia laughed again. "Edward, do you really think this situation has a future? You, a billionaire businessman, playing farmer with a woman. As you said yourself, temporary." "Marcia, no, let me finish." She turned to Claire. "Mrs. Bennett, isn't it? You seem like a decent person, so maybe it's better that someone is honest with you." Claire hugged the children tighter. "I don't understand. Edward is going through a crisis. A classic midlife crisis, actually. In a few weeks, when he gets tired of playing the simple life, he'll go back to Chicago and his real life. And you and your children will be exactly where you were before, homeless and without prospects." Marcia's words hit Claire like physical blows. Edward could see tears forming in her eyes, could see how she was struggling not to collapse in front of the children. "Enough," Edward said, his voice low but heavy with authority. "Marcia, you are leaving my property right now." "Edward, be reasonable. Now." The shout made Michael burst into tears, and Isabel cling even tighter to her mother. Marcia took a step back, clearly surprised by the intensity of the reaction. "Fine," she said, smoothing her suit. "I'm leaving. But you have 48 hours to return to reality, Edward. 48 hours. To decide if you want to save the company we built together, or if you'd rather watch it sink because of this situation." She walked to the car, then turned one last time. "And when you come back, because you will come back, I hope this temporary family doesn't suffer too much from the inevitable abandonment." The Mercedes-Benz sped away in a cloud of dust, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Michael was still crying, and Isabel was murmuring low comforts to her brother. Claire remained motionless, as if she had been turned to stone. "Claire," Edward said softly, "don't listen to what she said." Claire looked at him with an expression that broke Edward's heart. There was pain there, but also a terrible resignation. "She's right," Claire said in a low voice. "This situation doesn't make sense anyway. I always knew it was temporary." "That's not true." "It is, Edward. Look at us." Claire gestured to herself and the children. "Look at you. We're from completely different worlds. I was deluding myself thinking this could last." Edward felt panic start to take hold of him. "Claire, please don't let her words—" "It's not just her words." Claire went into the house, still holding the children. Edward followed her. "It's reality. You're a billionaire businessman on medical leave. I'm an unskilled widow with no money and no future. Sooner or later, you'll have to go back to your real life." "And what if I don't want to go back?" Claire stared at him with eyes full of tears. You will. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually you will. And then where does that leave me and the children? Even more attached, even more dependent, even more devastated when you leave. Isabel started crying too, even without fully understanding the conversation. Mommy, why is everyone sad? Claire knelt down and hugged her daughter. Sometimes adults get sad, my love. But it will pass. Edward knelt beside them. Isabel, do you remember when you asked if I had children? The girl nodded through her tears. I said no because I never had time for family. But you know what I found out? That maybe I was wasting my life on things that weren't really important. Edward, don't do this, Claire murmured. Don't make promises you can't keep. Who says I can't keep them? Claire stood up, rocking Michael, who had started crying again. Your company, your partners, your responsibilities, all of that is real, Edward. This life here, it isn't your real life. And what if I want it to be? You can't make a decision like that now, under pressure. It's too important. Claire took a deep breath, as if preparing for a plunge into icy water. Edward, I think it's time for me and the children to leave. No. Yes. I'm going to call my sister in Oregon. She said I can stay with her for a while until I get settled. Claire, please, it's decided. Claire headed for the bedroom. We'll pack our things today. We'll catch the bus early tomorrow morning. Edward was left alone in the living room, listening to the sounds of Claire organizing belongings in the next room. Isabel appeared at the door, holding her rag doll. Uncle Ed, she said in a small voice, Mommy is crying again. Edward knelt and opened his arms. Isabel ran to him and clung to his chest. Why did the mean lady say those things? Because sometimes adults forget what's really important in life, Edward said, feeling his heart break as he hugged this girl who had become so special to him. You won't forget us when we leave, will you? Edward closed his eyes, feeling tears he hadn't shed in decades begin to form. Never, Princess. I will never forget you. That night, Edward stayed awake on the porch, watching the house where Claire silently prepared the bags for departure. Through the window, he could see her folding the few clothes they had, organizing the children's few toys, trying to fit an entire life into 2 small bags. Marcia's words echoed in his mind. The company really was in crisis. Millions of dollars, hundreds of jobs, 15 years of work, all at risk. It was his responsibility, his life, his identity. But when he looked at that brave woman preparing to leave with 2 small children, when he thought of Isabel calling him Uncle Ed and Michael sleeping in his arms, Edward knew he had found something that no amount of money could buy. The question was, would he have the courage to choose what he really wanted, or would he let fear and obligation dictate his life once again? When the first bus passed on the main road the next morning, Edward would find out what kind of man he truly was. Edward couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of Claire packing in the next room, Michael's intermittent crying, and the comforting whispers she directed at the children. Every noise was like a blade cutting through his conscience, reminding him that in a few hours, that family would leave his life forever. At 5 in the morning, while the sky was still dark, Edward got up and went to the kitchen. He found Claire sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee in her hands, looking out, the window at the garden she had cared for so lovingly. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Couldn't sleep either? Edward asked softly. Claire started, not having heard him come in. Sorry if we made noise. Michael is restless. I think he senses something is different. Edward poured himself some coffee and sat across from her. Claire, about yesterday. Marcia had no right to talk to you that way. She didn't say anything that wasn't true. Claire took a sip of the cold coffee and grimaced. I knew from the first day that this situation was temporary. It was naive of me to start imagining it could be different. And what if I wanted it to be different? Claire looked at him with a mix of pain and irritation. Edward, please, don't make this harder than it already is. You have responsibilities, a life, a company worth billions. I'm just a widow with 2 small children who broke into your house. You were never just that. Then what am I? Claire's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, remembering the sleeping children. What are we? Because all I see is a rich man in a midlife crisis and a desperate woman who deluded herself into thinking she found a fairy tale. Claire's words echoed Marcia's so precisely that Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Is that what you really think? Claire closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I think you're a good man who is confusing gratitude with something more, and I'm a woman who let herself dream because she was scared and alone. Claire, the bus passes at 7:30. She stood up from the table. I'm going to wake the children in a bit. It will be easier if you aren't here when we leave. Edward felt desperation rising in his chest. You can't just leave like this. I can, and I will. Claire turned to him, and Edward saw she was struggling to maintain her composure. Edward, I need to protect my children. I need to protect myself. I can't let us get even more attached to something we know is going to end. At that moment, they heard a sharp cry from the children's room. Claire ran, followed by Edward, and they found Isabel sitting up in bed, crying desperately and pointing to Michael, who was convulsing in his makeshift crib. My God, Claire whispered, picking the baby up. Michael's body temperature was sky-high, and he was shaking violently. Edward, something is very wrong. Edward felt panic take over. Let's get to the hospital now. There's no time, Claire was almost screaming. Look at him, Edward. He needs help immediately. Edward grabbed the car keys with trembling hands while Claire wrapped Michael in a blanket. Isabel cried on the edge of the bed, terrified by the commotion. Isabel, put on a coat quickly, Edward ordered. We're all going together. The trip to town was a nightmare. Michael continued convulsing in Claire's arms as she sang lullabies desperately in an attempt to calm him. Isabel was silent in the back seat, clutching her doll tightly and watching her brother with wide eyes of terror. Go faster, Claire begged when Edward slowed down for a curve. If I crash the car, we won't help anyone, Edward replied, trying to keep his voice calm despite the panic he felt. At the hospital, a medical team received Michael immediately. Edward watched helplessly as the doctors rushed the baby into the emergency room, leaving Claire outside crying and shaking. He's going to be okay, Edward said, putting his hand on her shoulder. The doctors here are competent. You don't know that, Claire sobbed. You can't guarantee that. If anything happens to him, nothing is going to happen. How can you be sure? Claire turned to him with desperate anger. I already lost my husband. I can't lose my son too. Isabel approached her mother timidly. Mommy, is Michael going to be okay? Claire knelt and hugged her daughter, trying to compose herself. Yes, my love, the doctors are going to take care of him. Uncle Ed, can you ask God to take care of Michael? The girl's simple, faithful question hit Edward deeply. Of course, Princess, let's ask together. They spent the next 3 hours in the waiting room. Edward made calls to ensure the best specialists in the region came to consult on Michael. Claire remained silent most of the time, holding Isabel in her lap and staring fixedly at the emergency room door. Finally, the doctor appeared with a tired but relieved expression. The child is stable, he announced. It was a severe febrile seizure, but we managed to control it. He'll need to stay for observation for a few days. Claire collapsed in tears of relief. Edward felt his own legs go weak. Can I see him? Claire asked. You can, but he's sedated. He won't wake up any time soon. In the pediatric ward, Michael looked tiny in the hospital bed, surrounded by wires and machines. Claire sat next to the bed and held his little hand, whispering words of love and promises that everything would be okay. Edward watched from the doorway, feeling useless. Isabel was asleep in a chair, exhausted by the emotional tension of the morning. Claire, Edward said softly, you should get some rest. I'm not. Leaving him alone, she replied without taking her eyes off her son. I'll stay with him. You need to take care of yourself too. Claire finally looked at Edward, and he saw genuine gratitude in her eyes for the first time since Marcia's visit. Thank you for everything today. I don't know what I would have done without you. You don't need to find out, Edward said. I'm not leaving you alone. During the afternoon, while Claire napped in an armchair next to Michael's bed and Isabel played quietly with some toys Edward had bought at the hospital gift shop, he received a call from Marcia. "Edward, where are you? You need to sign the contracts today or we lose everything." "I'm at the hospital," Edward said in a low voice. "Claire's son is admitted." "What does that have to do with you?" "Edward, you're completely losing focus." Edward looked at Michael sleeping in the hospital bed, at Claire who had spent the night without sleep caring for him, at Isabel who called him uncle with such affection. "Marcia," he said finally, "I'm going to sell my share of the company." "What? Edward, have you lost your mind?" "I've never been more lucid in my entire life. Because of a woman? Edward, this is ridiculous." "It's not about a woman," Edward said, surprised by the clarity he felt. "It's about what I want for my life. And I want to be here, taking care of people who truly care about me." "Edward, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." "No. The biggest mistake of my life was waiting 52 years to find out what really matters." He hung up the phone and approached the bed where Michael slept. Claire had woken up and was watching him with an indecipherable expression. "Did you hear the conversation?" Edward asked. "Part of it." Claire hesitated. "You said you're going to sell the company." "I said it, and I'm going to do it." "Edward, you can't make a decision like that on our account." "I'm not making it for you, I'm making it for me." Edward sat in the chair next to hers. "Claire, yesterday you asked what you are to me. Do you want me to answer?" Claire nodded silently. "You are the first real family I've ever had. You are the first time I wake up in the morning happy to—" "No, I'm not alone. You are the reason I found out that all the money in the world isn't worth anything if you have no one to share your life with." Tears ran down Claire's face. "Edward, I know it's scary. I know it seems crazy. But if you give me a chance, if you give us a chance, I promise I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving this is real." Claire looked at Michael in the bed, then at Isabel, who had fallen asleep again in the chair, and finally back at Edward. "And what if you change your mind? What if one day you find you miss your old life? Then you can kick me out of the house," Edward said with a sad smile, "but give me the opportunity to try." That night, while they kept watch at the hospital waiting for Michael to improve, Edward called his lawyer and instructed him to prepare the papers for the sale of his interest in the company. Claire held his hand throughout the conversation, and when he hung up the phone, she whispered, "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Edward replied. "For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely sure of what I want." Michael opened his eyes in the middle of the night, weak but lucid. When he saw Edward next to his mother, he reached out his little arms to him. Edward picked him up carefully, and the baby rested his head on his shoulder with a contented sigh. "I think he approves of your decision," Claire murmured, smiling through her tears. Edward kissed Michael's forehead softly. "I hope so, little guy. I hope so." Outside the hospital, the storm that had formed during the night finally began to pass, and the first rays of morning sun entered through the bedroom window, illuminating a family that had been formed not by blood, but by love and the conscious choice to care for one another. 3 days later, Michael was discharged. The trip back from the hospital to the farm was completely different from the desperate race of a few days before. Michael slept peacefully in Claire's lap, and Isabel chatted excitedly about showing her brother all the kittens that had been born while he was in the hospital. "The mommy cat had 2 more babies," she told Edward. "Now there are 5 in total. Mr. Stevens said he can keep one when they grow up." Edward smiled, feeling a lightness in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. The decision to sell the company had been made, the papers were being prepared, and for the first time in his adult life, he was following his heart instead of his head. When they arrived at the farm, they found Joe Stevens waiting on the porch with his wife Frances, a plump, smiling woman holding a basket covered with a dish towel. "How's the little guy?" Frances asked as soon as they got out of the car, rushing to see Michael. "Much better," Claire replied, smiling. "The doctors said it was just a scare." "Thank God," Joe said, patting Edward on the shoulder. "You did right getting him to the hospital fast. In a situation like that, you can't waste time." Frances approached Claire with the basket. "I brought some chicken soup for the boy. It's the best medicine to get your strength back after being sick." "You didn't have to go to the trouble," Claire said. visibly moved by the kindness. "Oh, it's no trouble. We're neighbours. That's what we do for each other." Francis watched, Claire with motherly attention. "You're too thin, girl. You need to eat better. I'm going to teach you my corn cake recipe." Edward watched the interaction with a smile. It was comforting to see Claire being welcomed by the local community as if she had always belonged there. "Ed," Joe said, pulling him aside, "I need to tell you something. Yesterday a woman in an expensive car came by asking about you, said she was your partner." Edward's stomach tightened. "Marcia was here?" "No, she just stopped on the road and called me over. Asked if I knew where you were, if you'd gone back to the city. Said it was urgent." "What did you tell her?" "That you were taking care of your family, and that if she wanted to talk to you, she should just call." Joe frowned. She didn't look at all pleased with the answer. "Is there trouble, Ed?" Edward sighed. "Complicated business, but nothing that can't be resolved." That night, after the children were asleep and Joe and Francis had gone, Edward and Claire sat on the porch to talk. The air was cool and full of crickets, and the stars shone brightly in the pollution-free sky of the countryside. "Edward," Claire said hesitantly, "are you sure about what you're doing? Selling the company is a very big decision." "I'm sure," he replied without hesitation. "For the first time in decades, I'm absolutely sure of something. But what if you regret it? What if in a few months you find you miss your old life?" Edward turned to look at her directly. "Claire, can I ask you a question?" She nodded. "Do you miss your old life? From when your husband was alive?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Every day, but that's different, Edward. Anthony was my husband, the father of my children. We had a life built together. And can't we build one? We barely know each other. It's been less than a month since we met." "And how long had you known your husband when you got married?" Claire smiled through her tears. 6 months, but we were young, from the same background with similar dreams. You and I are two people who found each other when we needed it most," Edward completed. "Claire, I know it seems crazy. I know it's scary, but I can't imagine my life without you." Claire was silent for a long moment, watching the stars. "And if it doesn't work out, and if we find we're too different, then we'll try to adapt. Or, if it's impossible, we'll find a respectful way to go our separate ways. But at least we'll have tried." "With 2 small children involved," Claire reminded him. "If this doesn't work out, it won't just be the 2 of us who suffer." Edward felt the weight of the responsibility he was assuming. Isabel already called him uncle with such affection, and Michael reached out his arms to him whenever he saw him. Wasn't just courting Claire. He was becoming a father figure to 2 children who had already lost their biological father. "You're right," he said finally. "It's a huge responsibility. But Claire, I want that responsibility. I want to wake up every morning knowing you need me, that I have a purpose beyond accumulating money." At that moment, they heard Michael's cry from inside the house. Claire stood up immediately, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. "I've got it," he said. "You rest." Edward went into the room and found Michael sitting in his crib, crying softly. When he saw Edward, the baby reached out and stopped crying. "Hey, little guy," Edward murmured, picking him up. "Still feeling bad?" Michael rested his head on Edward's shoulder and sighed contentedly. Edward walked through the house, rocking the baby gently and humming a song his own mother used to sing to him when he was a child. When he returned to the porch, he found Claire watching them with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Did he fall asleep again?" she asked. "Like an angel," Edward replied, sitting next to her without letting go of Michael. "You're a natural with kids," Claire observed. "It's surprising for someone who never had children." "Maybe I always had the ability and never had the opportunity to find out." Claire reached out and gently touched Michael's face. "Edward, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When Anthony passed, I thought I'd never be able to trust someone again, that I'd never be able to fall in love." She hesitated. "But you make me feel safe in a way I didn't think was possible." Edward felt his heart race. "Claire, let me finish," she said softly. "I'm scared, Edward. I'm terrified of the possibility of giving myself completely and then losing everything again. But I'm also scared of the possibility of letting fear stop me from being happy. Edward held Claire's free hand. I'm scared too. Scared of not being a good stepfather, of not being able to make you happy, of finding out I don't know how to live a normal life. So we're both terrified, Claire said with a shaky smile. Completely terrified, Edward agreed. They laughed softly, and the sound of their laughter mingling in the night seemed to seal some kind of tacit agreement between them. The next day, Edward received a call he had been expecting but fearing. It was his lawyer. "Edward, we have a problem," Mr. Henderson said without preamble. "Marcia is contesting the sale. She's claiming you're not in a mental state to make important business decisions due to the heart attack and is asking for a psychiatric evaluation." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Can she do that?" "She can try. And with the recent medical history and your sudden decision to abandon the business, she might at least get a temporary injunction preventing the sale. How long could this take to resolve? Months, maybe more than a year. If she really wants to complicate things." Edward hung up the phone with a feeling of nausea. Claire was in the kitchen preparing lunch and immediately noticed his expression. "Did something happen?" Edward explained the situation. As he spoke, he saw the concern grow in Claire's eyes. "Edward, does this mean you could be without access to your money?" "For a while, yes. Marcia could manage to freeze my assets until the legal issue is resolved." Claire sat heavily in the chair. "And how are we going to live? How are we going to support the children? I have some savings in a personal account she can't touch. It's not much, but it'll last for a few months." "A few months," Claire repeated, clearly calculating mentally. "Edward, do you understand what this means? If you lose your money because of me—" "It's not because of you," Edward interrupted firmly. "It's an attempt by Marcia to force me back into the business. She'll use any tactic she can." Claire stood up and began to pace nervously around the kitchen. "Maybe she's right. Maybe you really aren't thinking clearly. Claire, Edward, you walked away from a billion-dollar company to stay with a woman you met a month ago. From any outsider's point of view, that really does look crazy. And does it look crazy to you?" Claire stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it seems like the most insane thing I've ever seen someone do." The brutal honesty of the answer hurt Edward more than he expected. "But other times," Claire continued, her voice softening, "it seems like the bravest and most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me." Edward approached her. "Claire, regardless of what happens with the money, the company, or anything else, I'm not going to leave you. We'll find a way to be together." "How? If you become poor, if you lose everything, then we'll work together to build a simple life. We can raise chickens, plant vegetables, live off what the land produces." Claire laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. "You don't know anything about farming." "But you do, and Joe Stevens can teach us." At that moment, Isabel ran into the kitchen, her eyes shining with excitement. "Uncle Ed, Mommy, the mommy cat let me pick up one of the kittens." Edward and Claire looked at each other over the girl's head, both thinking the same thing. Regardless of the difficulties they would face, they had found something precious in that house. They had found a family. The question now was whether they could keep it together when the whole world seemed determined to pull them apart. A week after the lawyer's call, the reality of Marcia's actions began to materialize in a cruel way. Edward was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when his phone rang. It was the bank manager. "Mr. Harrison, I must inform you that we have received a court order to freeze all your main business and personal accounts. Only your smaller savings account remains available." Edward felt the ground give way beneath his feet. "How much is left available?" "Approximately $8,000, sir." $8,000. An amount Edward used to spend on a single dinner was now all he had to support a family of 4. When he hung up the phone, his hands were visibly shaking. Claire entered the kitchen at that moment, carrying Michael, who had just woken up. She immediately noticed the paleness in Edward's face. "What happened?" Edward explained the situation. As he spoke, he watched Claire's face transform, moving from shock to fear and finally to a determination he hadn't expected. $8,000, she repeated calmly. "How long does that last?" "If we're very careful, maybe 3 months. Claire nodded, put Michael in his high chair, and went to one of the kitchen cabinets. She began taking out all the food and organizing it on the table. "What are you doing?" "Inventory," she replied, without stopping. "I need to know exactly what we have, how long it will last, what we can save." She paused. "Edward, are you willing to work?" "Work as what?" "With your hands, manual labor. Joe Stevens mentioned there's a construction site in the next town looking for laborers." Edward looked at his own hands, soft and well cared for, which had never held anything heavier than a pen. "I don't know how to do manual labor." "You can learn. I can look for work as a housekeeper or a cook." Claire continued organizing the groceries. "Together, maybe we can earn enough to survive until the legal situation is resolved." The thought of Claire working as a housekeeper to support the family he should be providing for made Edward feel a deep shame. "Claire, that's not right. You shouldn't have to—" "Edward," she interrupted him, turning to look at him directly. "If we're going to make this work, we need to be real partners. I can't be a princess you support. I need to be someone who fights by your side." Isabel appeared in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Why are you talking so seriously so early?" Claire knelt down to her daughter's level. "Uncle Ed is going through some trouble at his work, so we're going to have to be very careful with money for a while." "Are we going to be poor?" Isabel asked with typical childhood frankness. Edward knelt beside Claire. "Maybe for a while, Princess, but we're going to be okay. We're going to take care of each other." "Daddy always said that the family that works together stays together," Isabel said, remembering something her father had said. "I can help too." "How can you help, my love?" Claire asked. "I can take better care of Michael when you're working, and I can help in the garden Uncle Ed said he was going to make." The maturity of the response from a 4-year-old broke Edward's heart. Once again, she was offering to take on responsibilities that shouldn't be hers. That afternoon, Edward headed to the next town to look for work. The contrast between the BMW he drove and the simple clothes he had bought for the occasion did not go unnoticed by the other workers. "You really want work as a laborer?" asked the site foreman, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a suspicious gaze. "Because this isn't a game, Doc." "I need the work," Edward said simply. "Do you know how to lay brick, carry mortar, mix cement?" "I don't know any of that, but I can learn." The foreman laughed, but not cruelly. "Look, normally I wouldn't hire someone like you, but we're short-handed, and there's something in your face that tells me you won't quit easy." He paused. "Minimum wage, 6 days a week, 7 to 5. Deal?" Edward did the math quickly in his head. It wouldn't be enough to live comfortably, but it would be a start. "Deal. Start Monday. And Doc, leave that pretty car at home. Here you come by bus or on foot." When Edward returned home, he found Claire hanging clothes on, the line with Isabel helping to hand her the clothespins. The domestic scene was simultaneously comforting and painful, comforting for its familiar naturalness, painful to know that soon they would have much more work and much less security. "Did you get something?" Claire asked when she saw him arrive. "Laborer, minimum wage. I start Monday." Claire stopped what she was doing and smiled. It was a genuine smile, full of pride. "Edward, that's wonderful." "It's not wonderful," he said, feeling defeated. "It's humiliating. You deserved much more than this." Claire dropped the clothes she was hanging and approached him. "Edward Harrison, look at me." He raised his eyes reluctantly. "Do you think I care if you're rich or poor? Do you think what matters to me is the size of your bank account? But I promise to take care of you. And you are taking care. You're doing what you need to do to keep the family together." Claire held his face between her hands. "There's nothing humiliating about working honestly to support the people you love." The words, "people you love," hung in the air between them. It was the first time either of them had come so close to using the word love. "Claire," Edward said softly. "I know," she murmured. "Me too." They kissed there in the yard, with the afternoon sun golden over them and Isabel pretending she wasn't watching as she continued hanging clothes. On Monday, Edward began his new life as a worker. The first few hours were brutal, His hands, unaccustomed to heavy work, soon blistered. His back ached from carrying bags of cement. The other workers watched him with curiosity, clearly wondering how long he would last. But Edward didn't give up. With every brick he laid poorly, with every scolding from the foreman, with every drop of sweat that fell, he thought of Claire, Isabel, and Michael. He thought of the trust Claire had placed in him, the way Isabel had offered to help, Michael's smile when he saw him. Meanwhile, Claire had found work cleaning houses twice a week for 3 different families. The money was little, but together with Edward's wages, it would be enough for the basics. Nights became precious. Exhausted from work, Edward and Claire would sit on the porch after the children were asleep, planning how to stretch every penny, how to make the little they had last longer. "Know what I found out today?" Edward said one night, massaging his hands bruised from work. "What?" "That I've never felt so useful in my life. In the company, I made decisions that affected millions, but I never saw the direct result of my work. Today I laid a whole wall, a wall that's going to protect a family from the wind and rain." Claire smiled. "You're becoming a philosopher. I'm becoming a regular person, and I'm finding I like it." But the relative peace they had found was interrupted a week later when Marcia appeared at the farm again. This time she wasn't alone. She brought with her a process server and a psychiatrist. "Edward," she said with false concern when he returned from work, dirty and exhausted, "good to find you. You need to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, as determined by the judge." Edward looked at the psychiatrist, a middle-aged man with a professional and neutral expression. "Now?" "Now," the process server confirmed. "It's a court order." Claire appeared at the house door, holding Michael and with Isabel clinging to her skirt. The girl remembered Marcia's last visit clearly and was visibly frightened. "Edward," Claire said, softly, "it's okay, do what they're asking." The evaluation lasted 2 hours. The psychiatrist asked questions about Edward's decision to leave the company, about his relationship with Claire, about his mental health after the heart attack. Edward answered everything honestly, explaining that he had chosen a simpler life because he had found something more valuable than money. When the psychiatrist finished, Edward waited anxiously for the verdict. "Mr. Harrison," the doctor said finally, "I find no evidence of mental or emotional incapacity. Your decisions, though they may seem impulsive to some, are based on clear reasoning and coherent personal values. You are fit to make your own decisions." Marcia was visibly shocked. "Doctor, surely there must be something good." "There is nothing, ma'am," the psychiatrist said firmly. "Mr. Harrison is completely lucid and competent." After the visitors left, Edward and Claire hugged in the garden. The victory was important, but both knew Marcia wouldn't give up easily. "She'll try something else," Claire said. "Probably," Edward agreed. "But it doesn't matter. We'll face it together." That night, when Edward was putting Isabel to bed, the girl asked a question that caught him off guard. "Uncle Ed, are you going to marry Mommy?" Edward stopped adjusting the blanket. "Why do you ask that, Princess?" "Because you love each other, and when people love each other, they get married. At least that's how it was with Mommy and Daddy." Edward sat on the edge of the bed. "And would you like it if I married your Mommy?" Isabel thought seriously before answering. "Yes, but only if you promise you'll never go away, even when things get hard." "I promise, Isabel. No matter what happens, I won't leave you." "Then you can marry her," Isabel said with the seriousness of a judge. "But you have to ask right, with a ring and everything." Edward laughed, but there were tears in his eyes. "You're right, Princess. When the right moment comes, I'll do everything right." As Isabel fell asleep, Edward remained sitting by the bed, watching that brave child who had become his daughter at heart. Outside he could hear Claire singing to Michael and the sound of rain starting to fall on the roof. They had lost almost everything in material terms, but Edward had never felt richer in his life. The question now was whether they could keep that wealth when the world kept trying to destroy it. 2 months had passed since Edward started working as a labourer, and the family's routine had stabilized in a simplicity none of them had thought possible. Edward woke at 5:30 in the morning, had a quick coffee prepared by Claire, and walked to the bus stop to catch the 6:15 ride. Claire went out 3 times a week to clean her employers' houses, taking Michael along when necessary. Isabel had learned to be even more independent, helping with small household chores and caring for her brother with a maturity that alternated between impressing and saddening Edward. On that Thursday in December, the summer heat was especially intense. Edward was returning from work on the crowded bus, his hands even more bruised than usual due to an accident with a tool on the site. The foreman had praised his progress. In 2 months, he had become one of the most dedicated and reliable workers on the team. But the praise didn't diminish the exhaustion Edward felt in his bones, nor the constant worry about how they would pay the next month's bills. When he got off at the stop near the farm, Edward was surprised by a familiar car parked at the side of the road. It wasn't Marcia's Mercedes, but a black sedan he recognized as belonging to Mr. Henderson, his lawyer. The man was leaning against the hood of the car, clearly having been waiting for some time. "Mr. Henderson? What are you doing here?" The lawyer approached with an expression Edward couldn't decipher. "Edward, we need to talk urgently. It's about Marcia and the company." Edward felt his stomach tighten. "Did something happen?" "Yes, it did. But it's not what you're imagining." Mr. Henderson looked around, checking that they were alone. "Marcia made a grave mistake, a mistake that could change everything." "What kind of mistake?" "In an attempt to prove you were mentally incapacitated, she hired private investigators to watch you and your family. The problem is that these investigators discovered some irregularities in the company's accounts." Edward frowned. "What irregularities?" "Embezzlement. Marcia has been transferring company money to personal accounts for over 2 years. Small amounts initially, but they became substantial over time." Mr. Henderson handed a folder to Edward. "The investigators brought this information to me because they found she was using your forged digital signature to authorize the transfers." Edward opened the folder and saw pages and pages of bank statements, transfer documents, and detailed reports. The figures were staggering. Marcia had embezzled nearly $3 million over the past few years. Why did the investigators bring this to you instead of her? Because they realized they were being used in a blackmail scheme. Marcia wanted them to fabricate evidence that you were spending company money irresponsibly on drugs or gambling. When they refused and presented the real evidence they found, she tried to bribe them to destroy everything. Edward leaned against the car, his legs feeling weak. "What does this mean?" "It means we have Marcia in a very compromising position. She knows that if this comes to light, she'll face serious criminal charges. I'm on my way to a meeting with her now to negotiate the release of all your assets and your full reinstatement in the company." "Wait," Edward said, raising his hand. "I don't want to go back to the company." Mr. Henderson looked at him in surprise. "Edward, we're talking about billions, about your life back." "This is my life now," Edward said, looking toward the farm where he could see the kitchen light on and shadows moving behind the curtains. "Mr. Henderson, I want you to negotiate the sale of my share of the company, but now on my terms." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. And I want a significant part of the money to be used to create a fund for vulnerable families in the region, families like Claire's who need a second chance." 2 hours later, Edward walked into the house to find a special dinner prepared. Claire had managed to buy a whole chicken with the extra money she had earned, cleaning an additional house during the week, and Isabel had made a card with drawings of the whole family, including the cats. "What are we celebrating?" Edward asked, hugging Claire around the waist as she stirred the rice on the stove. "Life," she said simply. "Isabel said we should celebrate because we're all together and healthy." During dinner, Edward watched his family, because that's how he thought of them now, as his family, and realized he didn't feel a shred of nostalgia for the life he had left behind. Isabel chatted excitedly about a butterfly that had landed on her hand during the afternoon. Michael drooled happily in his high chair, trying to catch grains of rice with his small hands. Claire smiled as she listened to her daughter, occasionally wiping the baby's face with automatic, tender movements. "Claire," Edward said when the children went to play in the living room after dinner, "I need to tell you some things that happened today." He explained about the lawyer's visit, about the discoveries involving Marcia, about the likely resolution of the financial situation. As he spoke, he watched Claire's face pass through several expressions: surprise, relief, and finally, a concern he hadn't expected. "Edward," she said when he finished, "this changes everything." "How so?" "If you're going to have your money back, you'll be able to go back to your old life. You'll be able to have any woman you want, any life you choose." Edward took her hands across the table. "Claire, you don't understand. I've already chosen the life I want. I've already chosen the woman I want. But now you'll have options again. I always had options, and I chose you. I chose this house, this life, this family." Edward stood up and knelt beside Claire's chair. "Claire Bennett, will you marry me?" Claire gasped. "Edward, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life." Edward took her hand and kissed it softly. "I don't have a ring to give you now, but I promise to get the most beautiful one I can find." "I don't need a ring," Claire murmured, tears streaming down her face. "But Isabel said I have to do everything right," Edward said, smiling. "And she's right. You two talked about this. She gave me permission to marry you, but only if I promised never to leave." Claire laughed through her tears. "And you promised?" "I promised. And I'm promising again now to you. I'm not leaving. Claire, no matter what happens, I'll stay by your side." "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want to marry you." From the other room they heard Isabel shout for joy. "I heard everything. Uncle Ed, you did it right." The girl ran into the kitchen and threw herself into Edward's arms, followed by Michael, who crawled after her, babbling happy sounds. "Now we're a real family," Isabel declared. "Can I call you Daddy Ed?" Edward felt his heart break and mend at the same time. "It would be an honor, Princess." 3 months later, on a sunny March morning, Edward and Claire were married in a simple ceremony at the church in the neighboring town. Isabel was the flower girl, scattering petals she had gathered herself from the farm's garden. Michael, now almost 2, and walking confidently, carried the rings on a small cushion Francis had embroidered especially for the occasion. The church was full. Joe and Francis Stevens were in the front row, along with all the families Claire had worked for and who had become genuine friends. Edward's colleagues from the construction site were also there, wearing their best clothes and smiling proudly at the man who had proven that people can change. Mr. Henderson was there too, now not just as Edward's lawyer but as a friend. The negotiation with Marcia had resulted in the full sale of Edward's stake in the company for an amount that would guarantee his financial independence for the rest of his life. Marcia, facing the legal consequences of her actions, had agreed to all the terms without contest. But perhaps the most moving moment of the ceremony was when the minister asked if Edward accepted Claire as his wife and committed to loving and caring not only for her, but also for her children. Edward responded with a clear, firm voice that echoed through the entire church. "Yes, I accept Claire as my wife, Isabel as my daughter, and Michael as my son. I promise to love them, protect them, and care for them for the rest of my life." When they kissed to seal the union, Isabel shouted, "Hooray!" so loud that the entire church laughed and cheered. The reception was at the farm itself, decorated with flowers from the garden Claire had planted months before. Tables were improvised with sawhorses and planks, covered with cloths borrowed from neighbors. The food was prepared collectively. Each family brought a dish, creating a diverse and delicious banquet that perfectly represented the welcoming community that had embraced the new family. When night fell and the guests had gone, Edward and Claire sat on the porch, watching Isabel and Michael play in the garden with the 5 cats they had decided to adopt permanently. "Do you regret anything?" Claire asked, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. Edward thought about the question seriously. He thought of the life he had left behind, the luxury offices, the business dinners, the power he exercised over hundreds of employees. Then he looked at his simple house, at the toys scattered in the garden, at the children's clothes drying on the line. "Only one thing," he said finally. Claire straightened up, concerned. "What?" "I regret taking 52 years to find you." Claire smiled and kissed him softly. "Maybe it took all that time for you to be ready for us." That night, after they put the children to bed and brushed the cat's fur to much feline protest, Edward and Claire stayed awake on the porch planning the future. With the money from the sale of the company, they could renovate the house, create a small rural school for the children in the region, perhaps set up a support program for families in difficulty. "Know what I want to do first?" Edward said. "What?" "I want to plant fruit trees around the entire house, so that when Isabel and Michael are adults, they can bring their own children here and pick fruit from the trees we planted." "It's a good plan," Claire agreed. "A family plan." As the full moon illuminated the farm and the crickets sang their nightly symphony, Edward reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him there. He had come to that place looking for silence and solitude to recover from a heart attack. Instead, he found a family, a purpose, and a form of love he had never thought possible. The man who only wanted peace on the farm ended up finding much more. He found a girl sleeping on his living room floor, a desperate but brave mother, laughter, screams, dolls, cats in trees, burnt rice and sweet pancakes. He found confusion, chaos, and love. And above all, he found a new reason to live. A reason that woke up every day with smiles, that needed care and affection, that called him Daddy Ed, and that made him discover that true wealth is not measured in money, but in hugs given and received, in tears comforted, in laughter shared, and in the unconditional love of a family that chooses to stay together not out of obligation, but out of true love. And so, under the starry sky of the countryside, Edward Harrison discovered that sometimes the greatest miracles happen when we least expect them, disguised as problems we need to solve. People who need help, children who teach us that love has no age, social class or conditions. It simply exists, pure and transforming, waiting to change our lives forever.